I think Zoe is a doppelganger for one of my good friends from school. When I sat next to her, I was like, Elizabeth? It was really funny.
Yeah, I just admitted her.
Hi.
Hey everyone. Wow, I haven't been on a Zoom quite like this before.
Thank you so much for joining us. Roxanne and I listened to your presentation at the PDI group, and your story was so compelling about your TOPS program that we wanted the rest of our division to hear a little bit about it. So thank you for agreeing to jump on with us. We think the work you're doing is incredible.
Wow, well, I am really happy to be talking to you because I love sort of sharing our experience with this program, and it's got a really long history with us, and this is one of those things where you just kind of want other people to copy it and do it too. So I am really pleased that you invited me to kind of share more, and I hope it resonates with your whole staff, and hopefully there's a way forward, and always sort of offer myself as an open door too for more questions even after this, if it seems like some things might be doable in Delaware. And since a few of you have kind of already heard the presentation that I gave for the professional development session, some of what I share here is going to be pretty familiar, but I'll just kind of try to move through it at a slightly faster pace, because I imagine that you'll have questions and we'll probably want to spend most of the time on questions.
Yes.
Yeah. Would you like me to screen share the presentation I gave, or like the PowerPoint part, or just kind of talk?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, awesome.
I already did it.
Okay, great.
On this note, we have a recording just because we have 2 staff members not with us today, so not because we're gonna, go show this to everyone else known to man, but I just want to let you know that.
I'm not going to be YouTube famous tomorrow.
Maybe in Delaware.
Maybe in Delaware, yeah. Okay, let me get this put up here. And some of the early slides I'll just kind of breeze through because you don't need sort of the whole thing, but let me get back to the beginning. Let's see. I guess if I make it full screen, it's going to be a little weird. But, so I gave this. Can you see the screen share? Okay.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So I gave this talk originally as part of kind of a professional development session that AFS and NASA organized to kind of help plant some seeds of inspiration with people who are managing folk arts programs and might either be new in their positions or the work that they're doing is recently funded or recently sort of transferred to them. And so the premise of it was kind of like a case study of what can I do in a state arts agency. And my thinking for choosing TAPS to talk about was motivated by the kind of real world likelihood that a lot of people listening to the presentation already have full jobs and already have a lot on their plate, and might want some thoughts on structures that can be implemented relatively easy and with relatively low sort of staff time investment. And so to me, TAPS really kind of checks all those boxes. Because I personally right now manage 24 grants to TAPS programs. And it's only just starting to get to the point where it's kind of a lot, but I could do more and would happily do more if they would pay for them. So I don't know if anybody in your room other than Roxanne is familiar with sort of the North Carolina Folklife program. I think giving a really short just introduction to some of the other things that are under me kind of helps put TAPS into a bit of perspective too. So we're an older program. We've been around since 1977. It was originally a standalone agency in our department, but it then was moved into our State Arts Council. So now I'm pretty much just, an employee of the State Arts Council. I work in collaboration with my colleagues a lot. All of my budget is just kind of mixed in and part and parcel with the State Arts Council's overall budget. We get our NEA Folk Arts Partnership funds, and then we throw a lot of other stuff in the mix in order to make all of this possible. So I am not doing all of this just off of what the NEA gives me. That would be impossible, but with what the NEA does provide, I think anybody could kind of begin the pathway to sort of what we were able to grow with TAPS, because we started very small with it too. And so it's a long story, but it all starts in the same place, and that's with one program. So I had really amazing predecessors, Wayne Martin and Sally Peterson. Wayne Martin then went on to become our executive director for the whole North Carolina Arts Council. And I think that is kind of an important detail in how we were able to grow such a expansive Folklife program. And that's just to say that that kind of buy-in and, top-down support really was what made this possible. And we've also had occasionally some outside partners like South Arts, our regional arts organization, but really mostly it's our state and federal funds going into this picture. We have a couple core programs. The North Carolina Heritage Awards is also one of our longest running. It's been around since 1989, and it's a honorary and cash award to traditional artists around the state, modeled after the NEA Folk Heritage Fellowships. And this is really kind of a lifetime achievement sort of recognition. We participate in grants and special projects. So we don't have like a separate Folklife project grant, but I support our overall operations with project grants to make sure that there's area expertise. We occasionally have the resources to do kind of a side project, but these might kind of come and go depending on the year. We do an annual summer internship, which is a very nice way to kind of cultivate the next generation of professionals in our field in North Carolina. And we're lucky to have the UNC Folklore MA program next door. We do offer apprenticeships, which is another really common program genre for Folklife programs. This actually we never used to have. We didn't fund this. We still don't fund this independently. This we use South Arts funds for. So that this is kind of a newer thing. And part of the reason why we haven't really put a ton of resources into like individual one-on-one apprenticeships is because we've always had TAPS. So TAPS stands for Traditional Arts Programs for Students. And people often, I think it can be a little bit hard to kind of conjure what that model looks like, but essentially it's a sub-granting program. So we use primarily federal funds and occasional outside funding sources to issue grants to local community organizations. And that might be a museum, it might be a cultural center, it could be a Boys and Girls Club, it could be a tribal government, it could be a local arts council. We have a really robust county level arts council network, and a lot of those are sort of the home sites for our TAPS programs. And the basic concept of what's going on in these programs is pretty simple. We certainly didn't invent it, I don't think anybody really did, but we essentially are supporting these organizations to host after-school programs in their communities using local tradition bearers as the teachers to reach local kids. And the genre, the art form that they are building into their program is something that is culturally, regionally relevant to the communities that they live in. And then the local programs take those funds from us, $8,000 a year, and use that to operate their program. They pay their instructors out of that money. That's the number one sort of expense that they're using. We really, really strongly encourage them to have their programs be free or deeply affordable. There's a little bit of benefit to having, a little bit of financial buy-in. Psychologically, I think it helps people take things more seriously. But money should not be a barrier for any family trying to participate in TAPS. And the age range is loosely K through 12, but I'll kind of bring up some exemptions and some special situations. But that doesn't mean that every program has to be serving K through 12. Some say, we're just doing 4th and 5th grade right now, and we'll see where the pressure is to grow, and then we'll expand younger or older, depending on how things are. So it's a pretty straightforward, concept and model. And I'll get into sort of where I think the real unique thing about TAPS lies, and that is actually in our approach, our funding approach, as a state arts agency backing these programs. So I guess I kind of said all of this here, but the most unique thing that we do with TAPS is we are funding these programs essentially on a recurring basis. We don't use the language recurring because they are not, the grantees are not automatically re-upped each year. They do have to annually apply and complete a final report. They have to live up to certain baseline requirements for eligibility. They have to be a nonprofit, 501c3 nonprofit to receive a grant from the Arts Council. All of our basic sort of granting requirements apply, like they need an annual budget, operating budget of at least $20,000 a year, 2+ years of past programming experience. But we do it on an invitation only basis. And I'll talk a little bit more later about how this is a little bit of a double-edged sword, but it really is, I think, where TAPS has gained so much of its power. So we invite the same people to come back and apply every single year. And if you have been invited, you're getting the grant. So there's no will we, won't we. There's no doubt on the program directors or coordinators part. Our goal is to make sure that all of their focus and time and energy is being spent on growing the program and not on wondering whether or not the funding will be there for them next year. So we don't invite anybody if we don't think we can keep the money up over the long term. What we are really trying to avoid is a situation where we might say, oh yeah, we got you, and then it's only a year, and then they've set something up and then we're gone. Or, especially because a lot of these programs for us are in really rural communities. This is probably one of our best rural outreach, rural impact kind of programs as an arts council. They are often in places where there is no other affordable arts education available to their communities. And they are also used to, funders coming in and backing something cool because everybody likes to fund something new and then disappearing the next year and the program is gone. And so our goal is to not, be a fly through and to really build something that is predictable in the community, because in order to have the kind of community trust and support and ownership and buy-in, and in order for families to think ahead and say, oh yeah, I'm going to send my kids to this program next year, they need to know that it's longstanding and sustainable and it's going to be there. So I'll speak a little bit just kind of about that basic eligibility for the programs. We ask that they have at least 20 students involved throughout the year. This is kind of a newer requirement that we added after there was some feeling, of it doesn't look too great if there are only a handful of kids. These are sizable grants. They're not mega grants, but $8,000 a year is a lot of money. So we asked them to reach 20 kids throughout the year. They don't all have to be concurrent. They don't all have to stay throughout the entire year, but 20 individuals. They have to provide 30 plus hours of class time, including performances and events throughout the year. And that can include, like I said, like recitals, practice time as a group. And it's really important to us that artists get paid decently. They're never getting paid quite what they deserve, but in some cases, things have actually gotten pretty good. And we're starting to see some artists getting $50, $60 an hour. But we kind of demand at least, $20 to $30 an hour as a minimum. So primarily that's what people are using the money for, is paying instructors. And we do have kind of a system for if they're falling out of that range, and there's a probationary year where they have time to kind of get it together before we question or disinvite them. But I'll be honest, during COVID, we're kind of not even worrying about this right now because everybody was just so thrown for a loop. And we know that it takes time to rebuild. So at the moment, we're being extremely lenient with them about, enrollment numbers and that kind of thing. So, that's kind of it in terms of our grant guidelines or the eligibility guidelines. We are not really saying too much more about how they have to structure their program. And that's because the core thing about TAPS is that it comes from the local level and it responds to the interests and the realities of the local level. The art form that is taught must be of community interest and cultural relevance. It's got to be something that like kids might actually kind of get. So I actually, I wouldn't recommend starting a TAPS program that's centered on a cultural tradition that is so endangered or sparsely practiced that it might not be familiar in some way to the lives of everyday people in that community. Similarly, if there's really only one remaining practitioner and you're building a program around what they do and then they retire or they pass away or they get sick, similarly, that can make for an unsustainable program. And so we're looking, an ideal sort of TAPS candidate is a partner that can provide a program that has a clear cultural connection to that community and is popular and common enough that there's a world for them to kind of choose from for teachers, for students, for directions they can take their program. And we strongly encourage that the community is brought into the planning process. So if a program is like starting up from scratch, we want them to be putting together an advisory board, a steering committee, that kind of thing. And the way that the material is taught should be in keeping with the realities of that tradition or culture. So here in North Carolina, we have a ton of old time music, and a lot of our TAPS programs are teaching old time music. And that is music that you just got to learn how to do it by ear, because if you're chained to even tabs or, but especially sheet music, and then you go to a fiddler's convention and somebody puts a guitar in your hands and says, come jam with us, you're not going to be able to achieve full cultural participation if you're like, wait, I didn't bring my sheet music. But if you're learning jazz, for example, in Eastern North Carolina, we have a really rich jazz and funk legacy. And we have 2 programs that are dedicated to kind of helping pass on that knowledge and that music. Sheet music is part of jazz, like it's part of the language of jazz. And if you're going to be a jazz musician and you don't know how to read sheet music, you might struggle. So it's relative, they have to know their stuff. They have to know the world that they're entering into. And I, as the sort of administrator of all of the TAPS budget and programs, I am there for support and guidance, for oversight and monitoring, but control comes from the local level. So I'm not making decisions about who they need to hire. I'm not making decisions about how they set up their classes. I'm not making decisions about what they do for their final public performance. And I'm not really making decisions about what is getting taught even. I mean, we find a partner that we know knows themselves better than we'll ever know them, and we're off to the races. So right now we have 24 programs. Our most recent one is in Guilford County, which is this dot right here. It's our first program serving a community with a history of refugee resettlement. But you'll notice that a lot are in the western part of the state, and that's kind of because of the history of how we started supporting these programs. It all kind of began with a guidance counselor in Allegheny County, which is this little tiny county up on the Virginia border, very rural, very pretty isolated geographically, a high poverty community. And this guidance counselor saw the traditional music in her community, and she saw the struggles that kids were having in school and at home and living in such a rural place. And she always said, like, I'm not waiting for these kids to save this music, but I think that this music will save these kids. And so she created what is kind of the OR-TAPS program, and she called it JAM, which stands for Junior Appalachian Musicians. And that is basically the model that this is all based off of. So we saw her doing this work, and we were in the middle of a big cultural heritage, tourism and economic development project called the Blue Ridge Music Trails. And we started funding Allegheny Jam as kind of a legacy program of this cultural trails project. And that's actually been a really important kind of tie-in for how we've grown TAPS, is when we've been doing something around community development, around economic and tourism issues. It's essential that there's an educational component. It's essential that the local culture is brought in, and leaving behind a TAPS program is a great way to kind of have a permanent, ongoing, regenerative component of that work, so that we're not just kind of doing a public art project or doing, a little bit of work and then leaving. So after Allegheny Jam started up, and here's a picture of them, we started hearing from other local arts councils, well, we want to do that too. We could totally do that. We have all these local musicians. We have this incredible history. We've got the heritage, we've got the kids. And so eventually we started funding maybe one or two more. And then a couple of years later, another one got added. A couple of years later, another one got added. And slowly over time, and this is from about 2000 onward, we were gradually adding recipients of this grant. And so at the time, it was only these Junior Appalachian Musician programs. And I don't know that anybody had any idea how big it would get at the time. I think it was just evident enough in the moment that there were these partners that we had in places with a really important cultural heritage that we had a vested interest in nurturing and supporting financially. And so we just kind of started there. And if it had stopped at 5 programs, I think it would still be incredibly impactful. And I said in my other presentation, like, I could give a whole other talk about JAM and sort of what that's done for the region. But I will just say that TAPS funding is part of why it has been so successful. There are JAM programs in other states, Virginia, Tennessee, South Carolina. COVID almost wiped a lot of them out, but we had the TAPS funding. And so we stood by them and we continued to give them their grant. And they are bouncing back so much faster. We are guaranteeing that the artists are getting paid, whereas in other states they might be volunteer. And so TAPS is functioning kind of like a a make work program also. It's creating economic opportunity for artists without having to touch our Byzantine state granting system. They don't have to compete for the money. They don't have to file conflict of interest forms and no overdue tax debt forms in order to benefit from state dollars. And it has just been, I think it's really served these communities in a lot of different ways through good times and bad. So this is just one example of, this is kind of why there are so many in the West. After some time, we were working on the African American Music Trails project in Eastern North Carolina, and we were also, building helping support the development of a local cultural center in Seagrove, which is a pottery community. And the model that JAM had established just made so much sense for these other parts of the state too. We couldn't call it JAM if it wasn't Appalachian and it wasn't musicians, so we had to come up with a new name, and that's where TAPS comes from. So that's, if you're in North Carolina and you hear people talking about JAM TAPS, that's a little bit of the confusion that we created for ourselves. But TAPS is the name of our sort of funding structure. And now we've got all kinds of programs. This is Drummers World Drumline. They are hosted by the Boys and Girls Club of Wayne County. They teach drumline and majorettes in Goldsboro, which is a very economically challenged community. But this lead instructor, Orlando Mitchell, in the middle, when we met him through our African American Music Trails fieldwork, so Folklife methodology and sort of community development coming together in this beautiful harmony. It was so obvious that what he had built was already a TAPS program. So we weren't starting anything with him. We just kind of said, come on in, you're already doing it, you're already eligible. And he does incredible work. So he was able to buy all of these instruments for his group with his TAPS funds. And before, you should have seen the beaters they were working with. Pitt County TAPS, they kind of blended it with the youth public art program. It's also very connected to our African American Music Trails. It's also kind of a youth at-risk service program, although we don't typically want to call TAPS like an at-risk kids program. It was really clear from the beginning because we don't want to stigmatize folk life and traditional arts in any way, especially in the Appalachian region. We partner with the Triangle Korean School. They take a very broad approach to what traditional arts means. So they're also talking about cultural etiquette and language and Korean history, because I know K-pop is part of it. And I say, fine, do K-pop in your traditional arts class, because it's part of like helping the kids form a relationship to their culture. And so if you just start from a place that they aren't familiar with or have never dealt with before, that's a heavier lift than saying like, and you can also do K-pop. In the Hollow Ossiponi Nation, which is also kind of up toward the Virginia border in North Carolina, they do more of kind of a modular program. So they have like a teacher will come in and do like 2-week mini sessions, and they'll cover a lot of different cultural arts, as opposed to just saying we're only doing like music or we're only doing dance. And they also have an intergenerational component, because that's culturally relevant and really important, but also because they're in a super rural place and parents were driving an hour to drop their kids off and then just sitting around because they didn't want to drive an hour home, just have to drive an hour back. So they said, look, we got all these parents just twiddling their thumbs in the corner. Can they join too? And this is what's so good about this TAPS model, is that these rules are so malleable given the local realities that there's nothing stopping us from saying, sure, fine. So if you have a child in the program, you as the parent are also welcome to participate, and it creates a cultural space for family time. The Seagrove TAPS program partners with their local elementary school, so theirs is not sequential over years. They just take whoever's in that 4th grade class that year, and it's like an art elective for them. We never want it to be mandatory. We definitely don't want it to be like a forced thing that's part of the school day. But this is an after school elective, so they literally just walk from their school over to the Seagrove Pottery Center, and they get to learn from people like Sid Luck, who's a Heritage Award recipient and an 8th generation potter from Seagrove. So that's just kind of an overview of how vast this can be, and just to say that it is so flexible, is so not specific to North Carolina. Culturally, it could exist anywhere for literally any kind of cultural practice. I think there's room for it, adaptability for it. Some people come to us with they're already doing something and they just need funding. Sometimes it's more of us doing the work to say, we really need to be filling this representational void. We don't have enough people in this part of the state, or or there's this really important thing that needs to be happening, but nobody's doing it. So then we might be more sort of involved in finding a partner, helping them set up. But, once they're set up, my job as the administrator is really just to manage their grant and visit them when I can, but they are really totally self-sufficient in terms of day-to-day operations. And that gives me the ability to work with a ton of partners, while also doing all these other things like the Heritage Awards and the apprenticeships and other grants. And and then there's like lulls, there's a whole, this summer, almost nothing's going on. So like, there's just these times of year where I don't even have to think about TAPS, but it's just an engine that keeps going. So getting into some of kind of the like nitty gritty financial stuff that you're probably curious about. This is sort of the double-edged sword of TAPS, is that because we're offering sustainable funding, it can only grow as much as our leadership is committed to letting it grow. And the pie is only so big, and dollars that come into one program are probably coming out of another program. So that's very real. I think TAPS has gained the support that it has gained on our staff and with our leadership, because it has had so much, partly because we had an executive director who was a folklorist, honestly, but also because it has really proven itself over time, and because we were able to let it have a really long, it's a real marriage between us and these partners. It has really demonstrated its value, and that it achieves a lot of the goals that we were already trying to achieve in other ways. So we put a lot of like NEA underserved communities funds into this, because this is a fantastic way to do that. We put some arts and ed funds into it because that's a fantastic way to do that. We put, some resources related to like community development into it, because it's a great way to do that. So it's reaching more than just Folklife goals. It's doing what a lot of people on our staff are hoping our funds will do, and reaching the communities and families that we're always aware we need to be reaching better. So it's a slow thing. There's a waiting list, and that waiting list, I always warn people, like, this could be a long wait, and that's hard. And so if somebody were sort of starting a TAPS program from scratch, I might recommend coming up with some kind of structure right off the bat that allows for a little bit more coming and going. So maybe it's semi-recurring, like maybe there's sort of a rotation that allows for more people to be served, but in a staggered way. I would definitely encourage thinking about that kind of early on, if it doesn't seem like our direction of just kind of over time gradually growing the budget bigger, bigger, bigger is on the table, because that's just not going to be for some people. But again, also, if you're building it from scratch and have this kind of bigger statewide vision in a way that we didn't originally, I think it would be incredibly impactful just to say 5 programs, we're picking 5 partners in 5 different parts of the state, so that we know we're spread out and we're representing the state well, and we're just going to stick with those 5 and see what happens. I think that would also be really impactful, because it's that longevity. Some of these programs have been going on for 20 years. That's what really has I mean, we've watched it change the cultural landscape in a lot of these communities. There's kids doing things that kids did not do a generation ago. And in fact, kids were shamed out of being interested in a generation ago. And I think it's programs like TAPS that are, Wayne, our old executive director, called it regrowing the forest. And I think that that's a really great sort of metaphor for it. So I talked about this a little bit, just sort of what it looks like for me to administer TAPS. And I would love to share this PowerPoint with everyone so you can kind of see some of this stuff a little bit more in detail, but just, you know, it's on our annual grant cycle that I handle it like I handle all our other grants. I try to visit each program every other year, so I don't have to do all of them in one year. When we can't find more money, I also try to do kind of professional development or networking support for them so that they have a community of peers amongst each other. Or if somebody comes to me and wants to start a program, but we don't have money for it that year, I will still stay in touch with them and try to guide them and consult with them in lieu of, you know, funding. Because who knows, maybe years down the road, the door opens and they're in a great position to be ready to receive it. And, you know, I think it's just been a win kind of program for us. It benefits young people who can commit to years of learning something about their community or experience with the arts because they know it's going to be there in a recurring way. It benefits families because it's free and affordable. It helps people see that they and their culture are recognized and seen and acknowledged by their local arts providers. That the arts are not just this elitist space that has nothing to do with them. We often find that like a family's first ever point of connection with that local organization is through this program. And these are not people who were like season ticket holders or members or, you know, had ever been to like a gala or an art fair or an art walk. Like this is the first time they ever realized there was a local arts council in their community because their kid went to their program. Creates incredible teaching opportunities for local artists. The host organizations benefit because they're reaching constituents they don't usually reach. Helps challenge suspicion about public arts funding to say, yeah, that's your tax dollars that just bought you that banjo lesson for your grandson. And it strengthens their community relationships. And it's good for us because it gets our dollars where we want them to go. And has been incredibly high impact for a relatively modest grant size. I mean, $8,000 has been spent a whole lot worse than on a TAPS program. So I talked about some of the challenges too of expansion, and you know, there's a little bit of a catch-22 with the fact that they're in under-resourced communities. We want them to also raise money to be not totally dependent on our grant, but that's why they're under-resourced, because it's hard to raise money in communities like that. So they can become heavily dependent on this grant. And that's always a little bit of a concern. We don't ever want that to be, but when given the choice between them being dependent and that art form not being taught, I would rather that art form be taught and then be dependent. And there's a lot on our website too that I definitely encourage you to check out or copy or whatever. We have an introductory video that I think does a really beautiful job of telling the story, and we have our program guidelines and recommendations and strategies for TAPS programs. And all of that is free and open and stuff I'm also really willing to share directly with people. So it's hard to say that any briefer, but I'll leave it there and would love to answer any questions if you have them. Yeah.
Zoe. So in one of your slides, you talked about bringing the community in on, bringing the community and stakeholders in on the design of the program. When you say that, do you mean that your partners that are embedded in that community bring in folks, or are you guys going out to sites and doing that?
That's a great question, because that's really relevant just for like staff capacity too. The ideal scenario is that we have identified a host partner that is capable and motivated to do all of that work on their own. So like I personally have never attended like a TAPS advisory board meeting or anything. Because if they can't do that without me telling them to do it, they're probably not going to have a ton of success going forward. Or you know, if they have staff turnover and a really motivated executive director or program director retires or quits, we need them to have enough internal momentum to put the pieces back together without somebody from the state coming in and saying, please start your program up again.
Right.
Which, you know, is currently happening right now because like COVID devastated people's staffing, and so there's a lot of people who are stepping into positions. They're like, what is this? What were they doing? You know, who were they doing it with? Who was their support system? Who did they talk to? Where did they find these artists? So those might be moments where I might need to intervene in a more hands-on way. But in the normal course of things where there's a little bit more gradual transmission of job responsibilities and there isn't such a dramatic break happening, we really want them to be the ones doing that work themselves, because they're also going to know who to invite to those committees. They're going to know who are the local business owners. They're going to know who knows how to raise money around here. They might, you know, have the local sheriff or the mayor on their team, and I don't know who those people are. They're going to know, you know, what spaces in this community are recognized as accessible and safe and trusted. We're not church and we're not school. So it can be a little bit of a lift to communicate to community members that they should just drop their kids off at this place. And it's called the local arts council, or it's, you know, and so they're going to be the ones best equipped to build the alliances in their community that are going to create trust and buy-in for families. If we are helping them really start from nothing though, and especially if it's one where we are more involved in kind of identifying the need for a program in that community, then I might, you know, come and sit in on some of those early meetings and be the one to sort of introduce, okay, what is this program? How does the funding work? What are our expectations of you, and vice versa? But I would not be attending that meeting like every time they met. Yeah.
What about matching? You mentioned that a lot of your TAPS programs serve rural communities or communities that don't have access to that many resources. And $8,000 is a fairly healthy grant size. Like, do folks have trouble matching that? Or, and if not, how do they go about finding those funds? Is a reduced tuition part of the way that they can match the funds?
That's a great, yeah, really good question, and something that I'm actually kind of in the middle of trying to tweak and fine tune on our end too. So I don't know what Delaware has, but North Carolina allows us to waive matching for what we call tier 1 communities. So we have 3 tiers of economic health. Tier 1 is the most distressed. Tier 2 is kind of transitional. It might be tier 1 one year and tier 2 the next. And,
yeah, we have opportunity zones here.
Okay.
We could look at.
So you have a similar way of like a legislatively sanctioned way of maybe treating some people a little bit differently than others. Yeah. So if you live in a tier 1 county for North Carolina, you are not required to match any state grant, no matter what the category is.
Oh.
And since a lot of these programs are in tier 1 counties, there's a healthy chunk of them that don't need to match at all. My difficulty with the tiers though, is that it doesn't acknowledge that even in a rich county, in a rich city, if you are a recently arrived immigrant community, if you are a marginalized community, you are not necessarily also tied into, you know, arts philanthropy and funding networks. And if you are going around your community asking them to pitch in to teach their kids, like that pool of money is a lot less for the Montagnard refugee community in Guilford than it is for a predominantly white community in Wake County where Raleigh is. So I am trying to, during COVID, we allowed some of our grants to go down to a 2-to-1 match instead of a 1-to-1 match to try to make them more accessible. So in the worst year of COVID, we waived the match entirely for everybody. And now it's kind of in a transitional 2-to-1 phase. So if people's systems for raising their match in the past were really disrupted, we're saying it's okay, you really only need to be bringing us $4,000, not $8,000. And usually people can kind of make that up with like staff admin time, or you can't.
So the matches can be in kind. They don't have to be.
It can be some kinds of in kind. So they couldn't be like space, the value of a space that they're using and not renting, but it can be a portion of staff salary dedicated to it. It can be food, which we can't pay, but a lot of them do have to buy snacks because it's like,
sure.
Kids are starving. So there are usually ways for them to kind of get there with some, kind of soft combinations of cash and in kind. But what I'm really finding is that the 1-to-1 match is a little bit irrelevant, because the programs that need to have $16,000 of actual cash are finding ways to get $16,000 of actual cash. So they take our grant and then they will put whatever of their own resources or fundraising they need to get to that amount. The ones that are just matching our grant with like in-kind stuff, just to fulfill our requirement, but not because it's actually what they need to execute their program, they're not bending over backward to do more fundraising to make sure that that match is totally cash. So it really makes no difference if we drop them down to a 2-to-1 match requirement, because it was all just kind of admin time anyway. So I'm going to be advocating to keep it at 2-to-1 in the future, because I think that makes it much easier for people like the Montagnard Dega Association to come be a TAPS program. And even though they're in a relatively affluent county, their community very much isn't. And what they're doing is not something that people outside their community are really gonna care about, honestly. They're not really gonna see that and say, I gotta give to that, because it's very of, by, and for the Montagnard community. So that's kind of how we handle that. Some people abundantly overmatch. Some of the programs are their own standalone nonprofits. So like Allegheny Jam, for instance, being the oldest and the first, spun off and became its own 501c3. They can now go apply for their own grants. They've gotten NEA funding. They can do all kinds of things that a TAPS program that's more of just like an after-school class offered by a local arts council won't be able to do for itself. So in those situations, they're a little bit more dependent on, well, okay, how much is that partner willing to give to this program independently? Like how much of their own pie are they willing to slice up for TAPS? And some of them are very willing, because like I was saying, for some of them, like this is the heart and soul of like how they relate to their community. And it looks great. People love to support it. It really helps them make a case that what they're doing in their community is not exclusionary, it's not elitist, and people love to see little kids holding giant banjos. We try not to, one instructor once said to me, we're not running a puppy mill here. So like, we don't want them to just kind of trot their kids out as a fundraising tool.
Right.
But the visibility of those kids doing that, learning these things in the community, like it really does move people. And if done tactfully, can really help with fundraising as well. And
one last quick question before, I know other people probably have questions, but as this is a program that is centered on arts education and really cultural education, have you guys found any corporate donors that are willing to match your state funds that ties into any of their corporate dollars that are set aside for education?
You mean going like a match straight to the state?
Or
Or-
match straight to the,
Or straight to
to the
program?
administrator of the TAPS programs,
We haven't yet, but I think that is really going to become more and more necessary as TAPS grows. We recently created, I say recently, it was like almost 7 years ago now, but we're only recently really just kind of like finding its legs and staffing it appropriately. But there is now what is called the North Carolina Arts Foundation, and that is a independent nonprofit entity that can receive private dollars in a way that the state can't. And so this is something currently on my mind as we're kind of watching the development of our sort of policies around how we interact with the foundation and how we use it as a tool to support us, that we probably do need to be thinking about corporate relationships or private funding relationships via the foundation. So it just makes fundraising a lot easier for us. The downside, though, is that, and this can be done for sure, but it's the recurringness. You know, if some company were interested in sponsoring TAPS for a certain amount of time, but I wasn't convinced that they were in it for the long haul, that one-time boost is not that valuable to me, because I don't want to give it to their programs, they balloon to a size that they can't support, and then they're not hiring those teachers back the next year or something. So when we do have those opportunities where there is kind of a sudden arrival of extra funds, which often happens at the end of the year, it's like, oh, we have lapsed salary funds, and our division secretary loves TAPS. And so she often is like, here's some money, just get rid of it through TAPS. And so we'll kind of give a boost to the existing programs, or we'll try to provide an additional service or programming opportunity for them and say, like, we're going to do an after school camp that brings kids from different TAPS programs together, or we're going to do a showcase, or we're going to buy you all teaching materials, or or instruments and cases that, you know, are going to get so bashed up when the kids take them home. So that kind of stuff, it helps us keep them sustainable. But for the budget that I rely on to be the backbone of the funding, if I had a relationship with a private funder, it would really, I would need to know that it wasn't just going to be a one-time or even two-time thing.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And that's not to say that other people couldn't. I mean, it's just, that's just because of the place we've gotten ourselves into, where we don't really have a system for like turnover within that group. That's kind of what that requires. But I think if other people were to imagine their own version of this model, and there would certainly be ways to build in opportunities for one-time funding. Like, for example, one thing that could be done is like a two-tier level of engagement with interested programs. So you could have like 1 year of sort of kick the tires startup money, and it's a half grant. It's a smaller amount of money, but it's like a viability test. And then if they pass the viability test, like then they're kind of on the short list in the wait list, as opposed to just kind of leaving people on a wait list and then hoping that we get to them. There could be ways to do more sort of like infusions to the wait list to keep them going while we're waiting for permanent support to kind of open up.
Great, thank you.
So actually on that note, Zoe, are there other grant programs that can help support that infusion while they wait to be shortlisted and brought in?
Yeah, are you thinking like through our arts council, or just kind of within the state? Yeah.
Council.
A lot of our partners in this program are also getting grassroots funds. Unfortunately, though, we do have to be mindful about state funds not matching state funds. So they could spend their grassroots money, which is kind of our way of, we use the local arts council network to distribute money directly to the communities, and then they give that sustains both that local arts council, but it also sustains like organization and individual artist granting programs. And our legislature loves grassroots. Like they always give grassroots a raise and then ignore the rest of the arts council. So the grassroots funds could support TAPS related activities, but it couldn't go into the match for TAPS. We do have some people who've, with COVID, we loosened up a lot of our rules about eligibility and how many grants an organization can apply to at a time. So like right now we have one TAPS program that's probably getting 3 grants from the Arts Council, but I need to have a phone call with them to find out, are you going to be okay with all this money and all these matching rules? Because you're going to have like 3 very different kind of projects being supported by that money. Some people have really formed great relationships on the local level with like music stores are really great partners. Local community foundations, tourism, schools have not really, schools themselves, they're so busy in their own sort of realities that,
yeah, we know.
Oh,
yeah, it's tough to kind of cross those streams, but schools can be great places to like, if they'll let you in after hours, it can be a great place to hold the class, even if the school isn't the host of the class. So we use they use school facilities all the time, or they'll do like a sort of interest performance at the beginning of the year. They'll put on a show in a school during assembly, and then kids will say, "Wait, I want to do that. How do I sign up?"
That way. That's cool.
Yeah.
Do you have boys and girls clubs there?
Mhm.
And are any of these programs happening at those?
Mhm. Yes, definitely. The Drummers World one that I mentioned, which does drumline and majorettes, so we came directly to Alondo, the lead teacher, and basically said, like, who's a nonprofit that you trust that we could run this grant through? And fortunately, at around that same time, he had just struck up a relationship with his local Boys and Girls Club. And so they were already letting him use their gym, and were kind of advertising his class as a Boys and Girls Club program. So we fund the Boys and Girls Club of Wayne County. They give Alondo and his instructors the money. And I was very clear with them, if Alondo ever relocates, this grant comes with him, because we're funding Drummers World.
Right.
Yeah.
Seems like they are a good, like a quality, like an organization that people trust. You know what I mean? With kids.
They're a great partner. They're used to applying for grants. They can handle our complication as a state agency pretty well in a way that Alondo can't. They understand the community. They understand community work. They understand the value of the program. They want it to succeed just as much as we do and Alondo does. So they're excellent partners. The Hollow Saponi program has actually also become a Boys and Girls Club. Like, they just got a Boys and Girls Club in the community. And so now what we have been funding as their culture class is going to become a Boys and Girls Club offering. Similar, we have a jam program in Cherokee, and it's part of the Cherokee Youth Center, which is kind of a Boys and Girls Club. And then there's ones that we're not funding yet, but I hope we will. I mean, there's a Boys and Girls Club out on the coast that does duck decoy carving, and there's one also in Goldsboro that does like ballet folklorico, and like all of these. There's more potential TAPS programs out there. So in a more sort of scarce environment, like, I would suggest sort of carefully picking and choosing those early partners. Make sure that even at its most minimal form, you're still offering kind of an interesting and diverse spread of activities that are of particular interest to those communities to sustain, but also to you as the state agency with a vested interest in in the cultural landscape of like, what are you aware really needs this support, isn't self-perpetuating already. So yeah, I mean, if I had all the money in the world, I could make you 10 more TAPS programs tomorrow. And it would be pretty easy too, because the ones that are already doing the work, like it's just a phone call, like, hey, we've got this funding program. I think you're a perfect fit. Are you comfortable with these guidelines? Here's what it takes to get the grant. Boom, 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 you're off. It's not hard at all. And you don't even need to be a great field worker. You don't need to be a folklorist. You just need to know who are the organizations or partners locally who you really understand their own cultural landscape and empower them to make all the decisions.
Actually, something on that note, some of the organizations, and you bringing up Boys and Girls Club is perfect, because some of them could transition from what we have as a project support based grant and transition them to something that is TAPS. I'm going back a little bit. I just had a question about the funding. You had mentioned that you had applied for the NEA Folk Arts Grant. Who did you use? Because I know that state arts agencies aren't able to apply. Did you partner with somebody?
This is the standard folk arts partnership.
Okay. I'm sorry. It wasn't the project folk arts.
No.
Okay.
Yeah. It's the ongoing funding
through the state arts. Okay.
Right, that comes straight to the Arts Council from the NEA.
Thank you.
And when I say that we use that for TAPS, it's like we use it for every. It's so jumbled up. It's like a drop in the water. It's being used for everything, but it helps. It's a chunk of the budget. So yeah. And I think that like some of these programs are pretty sizable, but like they could do good work with $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 too. Like eight's not a magic number. With lower expectations, maybe a lower enrollment guideline, you could if you said you only need to have 10 kids, cut the grant in half. What has happened over time though is, $8,000 in 2022 is not what $8,000 was in 2000. So that's also part of my thinking about the match, is that we have essentially been weaning them off of the ratio of NC Arts Council funding that they started off with gradually over time, just by not having raised the grant amount over time. So that is, I think, on its own doing some work to pressure some of the partners into supplying additional resources, which is why whenever our leadership team mentions anything about dependency on this grant, I'm just kind of like, I'm not worried about that. Like, it's really not that worried about it. TAPS is a lot more reliable funding for them than like most of what their local options are. So, and I think the idea of maybe just starting with Boys and Girls Clubs is kind of brilliant, because that gives you a little bit of a structure to limit your scope and say, like, we're not just going to be fending off all of this interest from people, but we're going to say, like, this is a strategic partnership with Boys and Girls Club to make sure that where there is a Boys and Girls Club in a community where we know that there is like a significant cultural tradition that is important to Delaware's, identity and cultural diversity, that we're going to make sure you're doing it. We're going to make sure you don't drop it. We're going to make sure you're bringing the energy that like $8,000 buys you. So I think that's actually a really lovely possibility for sort of what TAPS could be in an alternate universe for us. Yeah.
I did have one question, and then we can wrap up. I know it's after our time. Do you require them to credit TAPS in any way, or the Arts Council? Like, how do you?
We require them to credit the Arts Council as their funder. When I first came on, I felt like TAPS needed more sort of like brand identity. But because of the nature of our program, that's been a little bit of an uphill climb, because so many of our programs are also these jam programs. So if you ask the kids, what do you do after school? They're gonna say, I'm going to jam. They're not gonna say, I'm going to tap. But if you're in another county, they're gonna say, oh yeah, I'm in the Surrey TAPS program. And that means something to them. Others pick like a completely independent name because that's the name of their program. So like the kids in Pitt County who are learning about African American music heritage in that area, I don't think they would say I'm enrolled in the TAPS program. They'd say like I'm part of the Youth Public Art Project. So I found that while I was able to make a little logo and I was able to create more sort of bonding and networking and connection opportunities for the instructors to think about themselves as peers, even if they're not doing the exact same cultural, tradition. It was a little bit of a dead end because really what they're called locally is what is going to matter to those kids, and they don't care who's funding that program. It doesn't mean anything to them, like the arts council directors, when I visit, they're always wanting me to like get up and say something to the kids. I was like, nobody to you. And that's the way it should be, because like they should care more that it's their local community center or arts council giving them this program than that it's the state. And it's nice to know, I like their parents to know that that's where their tax dollars are going. But in terms of the identity of the program, I've kind of given up on like wishing that they had sort of a common logo to use. And TAPS is, I think it might just cause confusion for them to attribute the funding to TAPS, because really it's like the Arts Council. And if you want to create more money for TAPS as like a legislator or a donor, you're thinking about the Arts Council, not TAPS. So we just kind of stick with our standard branding of like supported in part by the North Carolina Arts Council.
All right, thanks, Zoe.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Keep up the good work.